Thanks for listening to the Farmers Weekly podcast. Do remember you can subscribe to Farmers Weekly magazine and get all the latest news, views and market prices by visiting fwi.co.uk.
We went pretty deep into it, I suppose. It's the first major review that has been done of farm assurance really since farm assurance was created back in the 90s. We found a system that was really delivering in terms of assurances that consumers want around animal welfare and environmental protection and obviously food safety. But we found a lot of disquiet amongst farmers. We used the phrase that farmers felt this system and farm assurance was being done to them rather than being delivered with them.
A long-awaited review delivers its verdict on UK farm assurance. What does it mean for growers and livestock producers? We find out. We take a special look at the spring fertiliser market, and we've got the latest in the battle against the government on inheritance tax. But first, we meet a group of UK farmers who believe growing more beans and peas could help save the planet.
The Farmers Weekly podcast.
Welcome indeed to the Farmers Weekly podcast. I'm Johann.
I'm Louise Impey.
And I'm Hugh Broom.
First up this week, we take the pulse of peas and beans. Are they any good? Does anybody make any money out of them? Are they really good for the planet? And are they good for your farm? Berkshire grower Rob Waterston.
More bad years than good in terms of yield. Last year, just over 5.2 tonne a hectare. We've been low as 1.7. Disaster. And with that, of course, comes a poor crop of beans. You get no competition, so you get black grass, so you take a massive step backwards. One bad break crop, or any bad crop, all the good you've done is torn up. But the biggest thing we've done last year was drilling them a lot earlier, and that's the key. Get them in early, drill them deep as we can drill them, and that seems they get going. If they can get up out of the ground, even if it turns wet, they're okay. And I like the fact that they're good for the soil and good for pollinators. Spreads the combining the workload, so it just gives us that bit of a longer harvest window.
That's Berkshire farmer Rob Waterston, who has a self-confessed love-hate relationship with beans. In good years, the crop does well, but yields are inconsistent and performance is variable. Rob's a pulse pioneer, one of 20 or so growers trying to increase the UK area of the crop from 5% to 20% in arable rotations. There are many challenges, but success could bring many benefits. Rob says beans could reduce his reliance on pesticides and chemical fertiliser, and on a national level, homegrown pulses could replace up to half the imported soya used in UK livestock feed. All of this could hugely reduce UK farming's carbon footprint, but a host of challenges, including low returns, make it hard to grow pulses profitably. Roger Vickers, Chief Executive of the Processors and Growers Research Organisation, the PGRO, told a farmers' meeting in Peterborough this week that we need to consider the wider benefits of peas and beans, not just the finances.
You're going to get me onto gross margin, and I hate gross margin. I understand why people use it as a metric for their business, but with pulses, I think if you start taking them on a one-off basis, on an annual basis, unless you've got, I'd say, a 4-tonne yield, you're going to start finding and thinking that they're not worth growing. But therein lies the challenge. If you take them out and you look at it over a 4 or 5 year rotation, you're a lot worse off without them than you are with them. And the real trick, or the challenge I put out there, is for growers to get better at growing beans. We had in this room growers of over 9 tonne a hectare of beans last year, and I know they're probably the leading growers in the country. But if somebody can get consistently 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 tonnes a hectare, there's no real reason why everybody can't get over 4 tonnes.
That's Roger Vickers of the PGRO. Louise, we both went along to this meeting. An interesting, if somewhat unusual day.
Yeah, it was an interesting day. I mean, lots and lots of facts and figures about how we might be able to use legumes to replace some of the imported soya, the benefits that they bring to farms. Homegrown protein is a big topic, and we know that farms in this country could benefit from those markets. There's goodwill out there. People want this to happen. There's no doubt about that. It's just at the moment there's this disconnect, I think, between what is possible and what people are prepared to pay.
And therein lies the challenge in a nutshell. Yes, there is lots of goodwill out there, but one of the main reasons that more farmers don't grow more pulses is that there simply isn't enough margin in the crop. It often doesn't pay.
No, there's not. It's really variable, isn't it? Unless you've got an amazingly specific pea contract or something like that, it's not the most attractive thing. And if you speak to, I know a chap that always says that his winter beans he grows, he sees it as part of his whole wheat enterprise. So it's the entry into his wheat. It's cost neutral, and at some years it makes a loss, but he thinks it's worth it because of the entry it gives his wheat. But yeah, historically, there's not really a lot of margin to be had there.
And also, like any crop, you've got to fit pulses into the rotation in a way that works for you.
Yeah, you have got to fit it into the rotation. And of course, we are seeing some wider, more diverse rotations now. And, crops like beans and peas, they really do have a place in those. The problem is the sort of inconsistent performance that people have been seeing from them and knowing whether they're going to make any sort of contribution or not.
And that's exactly what Rob Waterston was saying. He was saying that this love-hate relationship, some years he does really well and some years he doesn't, Louise.
Yes, he does, doesn't he? I mean, he said he's been growing them for 7 years and he's had 2 good years from beans in that time and then some absolute disasters. And I think that's a very familiar sentiment that a lot of people will agree with. Yeah, you can have good years. And I actually went to Rob's farm last summer and his beans looked absolutely amazing. And I think then they did 5 tonnes a hectare. But there are other years when they really don't do that. And of course, if you have a big, a gappy crop of beans because they haven't established well, then you get these weed problems that just extend into the rotation.
Hugh, you don't grow pulses yourself then?
No, I don't. No, we don't grow pulses. The closest legume-y thing we get to is red clover in the rotation with the grass, but that's about it. And I suppose beans are doing better though. And if I think back to when I was a student, and then the de rigueur in the early 90s was you'd spin them on with a Vicon vari spreader and then plough them in. And if, as I did once as a student, this is pre-GPS and guidance on an old Massey 265, was sent to spread these beans. And it coincided with the year that the man came round to sell the aerial picture of the farm. And there was these huge triangle misses on all the headlands where I shut the thing off too soon because the linkage was knackered and it kept drooping down. So yeah, we've come a long way from there though, haven't we? I mean, whilst they're variable in their performance, the way in which we place the seed and how we grow it, I'd say is probably a bit more advanced. We'd like to think so anyway.
Those days of people knocking on the door and trying to sell you an aerial photo of
aerofilms.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, they must be out of business, I'd have thought, with everybody having drones on farms these days. You can do it yourself, can't you? But Louise, another challenge when it comes to peas and beans is, of course, people are opting for legume-based sustainable farming incentive options, at least in England, rather than growing pulses themselves. They're finding the SFI more attractive.
Well, they are, certainly to some people. I mean, it's strange, isn't it? Farmers are still growing legumes, but of course they're the ones that are funded by the SFI, not the ones they're choosing to plant as break crops. I think that's a little bit of an unintended consequence, probably, of the SFI at the moment, that break crops are taking a real hammering. When you just look plainly at the finances and perhaps some of the agronomic problems that you may be facing, the SFI is a real threat. That's very, very true. You've got these different types of actions, but the ones that completely replace crops, such as legume fallow, they are coming in instead of break crops on some farms.
Oh, yet another unintended consequence of the sustainable farming incentive. Hugh, you were talking earlier on about your friend who sees pulses as part of the whole wheat enterprise on his farm. This is the sort of thing that Roger Vickers of the PGRO was saying at the Soya to Sustainability event. We should see pulses, peas and beans, in a wider context. It's not just about gross margins and simply profits and loss. They do have wider benefits. They are good for the soil, for example. They do save you money in terms of artificial fertiliser. There's a bigger picture here.
Yeah, no, he's not wrong, and we see that if we use a red clover in our rotation, for example, you do a 2-year red clover lay and then we go into maize, it's amazing. You do get that benefit, definitely. In the same way that, as I said earlier, you get with beans going into wheat. But ultimately, in these constrained times when people are absolutely, and quite rightly, they're really concerned about farm margins, they're really concerned about the best they can do with what they've got on offer. And what that offers financially in terms of their rotation, at the moment they are going to be some way down the queue unless you're a devoted follower or you've utterly perfected consistent performance and perfect output. But it comes to the bigger question though, Johann, doesn't it? Part of you going to this conference and the theme of this conference was talking about how can we transpose and replace some of these imported proteins. And I suppose the bottom line, would it be fair to say it's not going to be easy, is it? Because you can't grow soya here very well.
Well, exactly. David McNaughton from Soya UK was saying that, they were doing really well in encouraging people to grow soya in the UK just a few years ago. But then 2019 came along, not a good summer. 2020 similarly, and now they're down to just a sort of a handful of acres or hectares. Domestically grown soya is never going to replace imported soya. We simply don't have the amount of land available, especially at the sort of yields that we're getting in the UK. But there are growers out there who are using pulse crops to replace imported soya or feed based on imported soya.
Yeah, we did hear from John Seed, who's a grower up in Scotland in the Borders, and he is successfully growing beans and also successfully replacing some of the diet that his laying hens receive. He's got up to, I think it's 18% inclusion rates with beans in their diet. So there are people who are really making a success of it. I don't think it's been an easy pathway for him, but he has made it happen on his farm.
I suppose the big thing, it's all around the soy question, isn't it? If you look at the amount of soy that comes into the UK, I know when the Sustainable Food Trust did a thing a few years ago, it's about just over 2 million, like 2.2 million tonnes, of which about 1 million tonnes of that is used to feed humans. Another 1 million tonnes is monogastric, i.e. pigs and poultry. You could include the humans in that as well. And then you've got a couple 100,000 tonnes of ruminant requirement, predominantly in dairy cow diets. It's easier, I suppose, in some ruminant. We use, for example, rape meal, which works really well in a beef ration. Probably not as available as the soya, but it certainly does a pretty good job. But ultimately, Johann, it's going to come down to, is it not better, I suppose, audit until we can actually grow soya or a similar. It might be, look, we get into insects in the next 5 years, and you've got this amazingly degradable protein that's available there. But until we get to that place, it's going to be about better audit on your soya, knowing where it's coming from. And that will cost, won't it? Because at the moment, if you bring 100,000 tonnes into Europort, into Rotterdam to distribute around Europe, including into Tilbury, say, for UK use, you're in the boat with everyone that wants the cheap stuff, as well as the people that want the expensive stuff, and the expensive stuff that's certified that might come from North America. It is expensive for a reason, because it is certified and it's available in lesser volume. So there's no easy fix, is there, to this?
No, you're right. There's no easy answers. There's no quick fix. We heard at the conference that UK farmers are trying to do the right thing, and yet they're being undercut by imports of soya produced using methods that would be illegal in the UK, for example, produced on farmland created by destroying the rainforest. So a lot of this is down to government policy and what the government is happy to see coming into the country in terms of imported soya. And a lot of this too is down to retailers and processors. and what they are willing to pay farmers. So are UK retailers, UK processors willing to pay UK farmers a little bit more for doing the right thing and feeding livestock on sustainable foodstuffs? Now, that is another question. So you're right, there are no easy answers, but these farmers, these Pulse pioneers involved with this nitrogen climate smart project are determined to explore ways of trying to do the right thing, and the big challenge is to make it pay.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
You're listening to the Farmers Weekly Podcast. Welcome along wherever you're listening to us from. You can email us at podcast@fwi.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're in the UK, you can also message us by texting the word farm followed by your message to 88440. A message this week from Guy Kirkwood, who says, great to hear Hugh back on the podcast. His turn of phrase always makes me smile. White glovery indeed. Hugh, not the only good news this week, other farming supporters too.
Yeah, other farming supporters. A big story, I think, this week, the last few days, has been more retailers coming out criticising the government's policy on inheritance tax, and particularly for farmers. The key one for me is the Tesco one, the Tesco COO saying that this policy puts food security at risk. And joined also by other Aldi, Lidl are on there now. Follows on from what we talked about last week with Morrison's line. This is unprecedented, would you say, Louise? You know, all the times you've been watching farming news, the supermarkets commenting on government policy. It just doesn't happen, does it?
It doesn't happen very often. No, you're absolutely right. And it's certainly, they don't comment about farming very often either. So, we may have had, sometimes the industry may have had its disagreements with supermarkets and the power that the retailers have. But this is, for me, I agree with you. It is a significant move. And when you get the CEO of Tesco saying this is not just a debate about policies, we're looking at the whole future of food security, then you know that they're taking it very seriously, and you really do hope that the government is listening.
Farming's Day of Unity across the UK this weekend. Burns Night in Scotland, of course, too. Farmers coalescing everywhere.
Yeah, they are, Johann. I think there's farmers in pretty much every county across the UK who's going to be out talking to consumers on Saturday morning, predominantly, I think, in supermarket car parks, handing out leaflets, just explaining the situation and just talking to the consumers. It's a really important thing. And loads of farmers everywhere taking part. And I think they'll be buoyed on by some of the comments from the retailers this week with their position statements on this government policy.
Yeah, no, it's been interesting to see Victoria Atkins, the shadow DEFRA minister, and of course we had her on the podcast last week. She was at the Tesco reception on the day that they called for the family farm tax to be looked at. So the public is going to hear a bit more from farmers this weekend. That's fine, because I think we recognised last week, didn't we? There is still a lot of support for farming. People want it to turn out right for them. So it'll be interesting to see which supermarket Rachel Reeves does her shopping in this weekend.
It will indeed. The Chancellor of the Exchequer rapidly running out of options when it comes to friendly supermarkets. What with Tesco, Lidl, Morrison's, all supporting farmers against the government when it comes to inheritance tax. If you are taking part in Farming's Day of Unity, we wish you all the best, and do let us know how you get on. Text the word farm followed by your message to 88440.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
Now, as you heard at the top of the podcast, too many farmers feel farm assurance is something that's done to them, not something that's delivered with them. That's the conclusion of a long-awaited review by 4 independent commissioners into farm assurance across the UK. Their report contains a raft of recommendations, including a fundamental reset, a change of governance and leadership culture at Red Tractor, the UK-wide assurance scheme. We spoke to Independent Commissioner James Withers and started by asking him about the findings.
So we went pretty deep into it, I suppose. It's the first major review that has been done of farm assurance really since farm assurance was created back in the 90s. We found a system that was really delivering in terms of assurances that consumers want around animal welfare and environmental protection and obviously food safety. But we found a lot of disquiet amongst farmers. We used the phrase that farmers felt this system and farm assurance was being done to them rather than being delivered with them. And what that really meant is farmers have felt they've become more and more distant and more detached from farm assurance. Now, that wasn't the same story across all of the UK. In fact, we found in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in particular, the system was working well, the schemes were well respected by farmers, there was high levels of trust, and actually the relationship between the schemes and farmers on the ground was really collaborative. That was less the case for UK-wide schemes, and not surprisingly, I suppose, that the bulk of the criticism, certainly the biggest noise we picked up, was about Red Tractor, and that's probably not surprising. It's the biggest scheme, obviously, but it probably speaks a little bit to both the fallout from the Greener Farm commitment, but actually what has grown over time is this sense that farmers have lost a little bit of control and certainly a sense of ownership of the schemes and the whole system.
Now, you mentioned the Greener Farms commitment, James. This is the idea introduced by Red Tractor that farmers should measure their carbon footprint, and that information could then be used so retailers can meet their own sustainability targets.
Yeah, the Greener Farm commitment really was kind of lit the blue touch paper, really. Our instinct as the commissioners who did this, and the four of us that worked on this for 9 months, spoke to farmers, in every part of the country. There was a big survey that was done. We had loads of meetings, we were at agricultural shows. The overwhelming sense we got was a lot of unrest around the Greener Farm commitment, precisely for that point you make, Johann, which is that the retailers were somehow passing on what should have been their commitments down the supply chain. It was just easy for them to pass on down, and farmers had very little say in that other than just end up with a pile load of commitments, requirements and standards being put on them. But the wider sense was that if it hadn't been for the Greener Farm commitment, there would have been something else, another catalyst to kind of lift the lid on this unrest that farmers were feeling on the ground. So what we said in the recommendations is that actually, we know that consumer requirements around environmental commitments are going to change. We know customers' requirements are going to change and they're going to evolve. UK farming needs to show some leadership on this. It needs to grab ownership of this and determine what the future directions for environmental performance, environmental recording and monitoring should be. But that needs to be done collectively. Red Tractor aren't going to touch this subject again, I don't think, unless the unions, AHDB and others in the supply chain get together and decide what the future direction should be. On Red Tractor, we believe there needs to be a change in leadership culture in that organisation. Red Tractor will quickly describe themselves as existing for consumers, not for farmers. We think that is far too simplistic, and we think that's actually symptomatic of an organisation that has drifted too far away from its farming base. So it needs a new culture. It needs to really grasp the level of disquiet, the level of concern. We don't think this should become an existential issue for Red Tractor, but frankly, if they don't grasp the seriousness of this and move really quickly to rebuild those bridges, it could become one.
Interesting choice of words there, James. A change in leadership culture rather than a change in leadership itself.
Yes, so we think there's a responsibility there for the board, for the senior leadership team, and actually for the owners of Red Tractor. So you've got the farm unions in there, you've got AHDB, you've got BRC. They all have a responsibility to now respond to hopefully what is a really constructive message from us, which is that, we want a UK-wide scheme that works. People want it to be successful, but too many people have lost confidence in it. And that is a really dangerous position for any organisation or any assurance scheme to be in. So that needs to be addressed. It will be the view of the board, the leadership team and the owners how best that is done. But as I say, the main message is the current position isn't sustainable. It's a really serious situation, but it's retrievable.
And just to be clear on all that, James, you think overall farm assurance is something that should stay? We should stick with it rather than get rid of it?
Yeah, so the headline message from us is the farm assurance system at its core is working. It's delivering assurances for consumers, and that's what matters. And I suppose if we think back to 30 years, where farm assurance was born from was a decade of food scares. BSE obviously being the most notable one, but we had salmonella, various other food scares. So farm assurance was an important and actually a really impressive response that the industry led to that. All the drivers for that still remain in place, with other additional requirements around environment and other things and animal welfare that will build in time. Farm assurance system is important. It's absolutely part of the future. It should run as a golden thread through the UK food and farming industry, but there's a whole heap of changes that are required. Things working really well in devolved areas, but there are other areas where these schemes really need to drive some improvements, not least in how it's delivered. It's not if this should be delivered, it's how it's delivered in a way that brings farmers with them and they don't just feel as though they're victims of a system that they've lost control of.
That's James Withers, co-author of the UK Farm Assurance Review. So Hugh, too many farmers feel that farm assurance is something that's done to them, not something that's delivered with them. James Withers, some strong words there.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely fair assessment of how people feel about it. There's lots of reasons why they feel that way about it. I mean, the report states, doesn't it? I mean, there's 9 key strategic recommendations. And actually, it sort of states that, one of the things that assurance schemes have got to get better at is communicating to farmers why it's important to do it so that they feel part of it. And actually, they see it as a benefit. And I know that sounds a bit airy-fairy, but this is part of the problem. The comms are so bad, people have just put up barriers and go, oh, farm assurance. Brr. They don't actually see it as a gateway or as a passport to the marketplace. They just see it as an imposition, an inconvenience, and yet another thing on the to-do list.
That's the thing, isn't it? With this, the whole thing, as James Withers was saying, the thing that sort of lit the blue touch paper was this idea that farmers should carbon footprint their business, their enterprises, as a way of helping retailers meet their sustainability targets. He's saying that they don't feel that that is going to come back now because it's just untenable and farmers are just not going to accept it. But that's going to have implications for the whole of the supply chain, including farmers, isn't it?
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, we've all love it or hate it. Let's exclude what's happening in America at the moment and the fact that Donald John stood up and ripped up the Paris Accord. But if we assume that we are carrying on a net zero path in the direction of travel that we are, we will all have to get very good at emissions profiling our businesses, as we've said a million times before. And that is to go towards the Scope 3 returns for all of these large companies that are buying our raw materials. That is going to become a fact of life. Whether you love it or hate it, it is not going to go anywhere. So I think it's slightly deluded to say that. And actually having a really good assurance system, which is really easy to use, uses the latest technology. You can bash stuff in onto a platform and it does all your sums for you. It tracks live data coming out of your business. And is a one-stop shop for doing that, that's cheap, that's got to be a good place to get to, hasn't it? And if you don't need to be involved in that because no one cares about your Scope 3 emissions because you're selling to the man that lives next door or to the little corner shop down the road, fine, you don't need to do that. You just have a deal with the person that's there. But I think, I think that slightly dodges the bullet. That bullet is coming whether you love it or hate it. Unless, of course, there is a total policy change away from the current net zero journey, which I see as unlikely, but you never know, hey, Johann?
Well, that's right, isn't it? And then from an arable point of view, Louise, we see producers here, grain producers, cereal growers, jumping through lots of hoops because of farm assurance. That adds cost to their business. And then they're being undercut, as we've just seen in the soya situation, by cheaper imports that are produced using methods that would fail assurance standards here.
Yeah, I mean, there's long been grumbles about that, hasn't there? And we've all, heard those and been made aware of those. I think as these audits have got more onerous, more expensive, and if you like, more petty, that issue about the cheaper imports or not produced to the same standards has just been sort of coming up the agenda for them, really. My question, I think, and I'd be interested to know what you two think about this, is what does reset mean? What is actually going to happen next? They've said that farm assurance needs this reset, but I'm not quite sure what the next step is.
Yeah, interesting that the report calls for a change in leadership culture, but it doesn't go as far as calling for a change in leadership in personnel itself. Hugh, is that achievable?
Anything is possible. I think it's page 118 of the report is pretty, it's pretty robust when it says about things that might need to change in terms of leadership at Red Tractor and in terms of how they communicate that. It's back to the whole communications thing. Louise was just saying about, I get arable farmers are really cross about this because they have jumped through what we've seen over the evolution of Red Tractor, I suppose. arable farmers have jumped through more hoops than most over the last 20 odd years, whether it's down to numbering grain trailers, putting covers over strip lights above the grain bins and so on and so forth. So actual physical, tangible things on the ground, on the farm, that investment's been huge. And yet, they're cross because they don't see a Union Jack on a loaf of bread. And I get that frustration. Whereas on the livestock side, we were probably the slowest coming to the party. We're ticking along quite happily. And there's little red tractor Union Jacks all over our packs of beef and our packs of lamb and pork and everything else. So you can understand where some of that frustration comes from like that. In terms of competing with the rest of the world, we're never going to be able to do it. And there's always this argument for having this, Billy Basics import spec equivalent if you're producing, say, for example, feed grain to go into compounders. Why should you jump through all these? That is a really big question to answer. But the only way you're going to answer all of these questions is if you communicate better with the people in the supply chain, with the primary producers who should feel, I think, that they own more of this, that they're more in charge of this. And that's one of the things that of the 9 recommendations that says, the governance has got to improve. It's got to be more embracing everything. It's got to be simplified. It's got to embrace technology. Just make it easier. And actually, with the technology that's there now, you could make it really easy. It's clunky. It's duplicated. The fact that you can't get, it used to be, for example, on the livestock side, that if you were RSPCA assured, okay, there's controversies around that, but actually it's a good scheme. If you're RSPCA assured, that out-trumped red tractor, so you didn't need to do a red tractor audit. Well, because of politics and people falling out and so on and so forth, you've now got to do 2 separate audits. Dairy people having 3 separate or more. I think there's one example where it's like over 15 audits in 1 year one producer had in this report. So make it simple. Have just one. It says, how about reducing on-farm audits and simplifying that delivery, but actually just having one damn good audit a year where you have to have nothing else. Great, let's do it. And the supply chain can believe in it and everyone's happy. And if you don't want to be part of it, fine, find your own market, don't be part of it.
Yeah, this idea that we reduce the duplication of inspections, that is a recommendation in the report. I mean, at the moment, it's like the local council coming round to dig up the road outside your house to repair a broken water pipe. And then, I don't know, the electricity company coming round the following week to dig up the road again to do something else. It would be better if all of these inspections were coordinated. And like you say, Hugh, there was one sort of big inspection or something each year. But the report is clear that it's not just about making it easier for farmers per se. Farmers also have a duty to make assurance easier for the rest of the supply chain as well, including processors, for example.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that comes back to the whole communication thing. And when I was in a lamb factory at the beginning of December, fantastic place, doing a lot of sheep every week, really diverse markets they were going to, a lot of export, stunned halal, lots going on, okay? And when we sat down with the factory owner at the end of the tour around the workspace, and I said, what's the single biggest thing that farmers could do to make your life easier? And his reaction was, if everyone was farm assured, it would make, because all through the factory visit, there was racks of lamb that were assured, racks of lambs that weren't assured, and so on and so forth. And you just think, yeah, this is crazy. And he was doing a phenomenal job segregating them as he should, as per the specification. But then there's some in the industry saying, oh, yeah, because we're exporting everything, it doesn't matter that we're not farm assured. Well, actually, it would add some value and it would make life easier. And actually, if you went to these people and said, look, we're going to give all these farm assured lambs into the factory, you would think, based on that evidence, that there would be a benefit for the supply chain and therefore they might pay a bit of a premium. And we do see that premium. I know when I used to sell lambs, the problem at the moment is slightly distorted in the case of sheep because the sheep price is so high. But certainly when the market's struggling, you want every last few pence on those kilos. And if you've got a farm assurance ticket, which has cost you £180 or whatever, then surely that's the way to go. But it comes back to just better understanding, isn't it? Better understanding, simplification, use of technology to make day-to-day stuff really easy when you're gathering all the data that you need to gather, so you do it on a regular basis, and then just better communication and governance right throughout the whole thing, and then everyone feels part of it, and actually we've got something to be proud of and something that we can move forward with and add value to the products that we're producing.
Well, there you go, everybody. That's the livestock side of farm assurance sorted, courtesy of Hugh. Louise, the arable side of things, in all seriousness, that's very, very different, isn't it? There is no real added value from farm assurance. Cereal growers, commodity crops, assurance doesn't buy you a premium. It just buys you access to the market. Extremely frustrating.
Yeah, there's a big difference, isn't there, with what Hugh's just described with the lambs. Of course, there is no market for non-assured grain. That's the difference here. So you have to have assurance if you're producing grain to be able to sell it. So that's, I think, where there's a difference with arable farmers and why they have been so dissatisfied with the system that was running. The other point, I think, which I know some of them will say, technology, absolutely, yes, make it easier, make it quicker, make it less time consuming, but will there be a cost of that? And if so, who will bear that cost? That's another question, I think.
Just one question of many, and Red Tractor has welcomed the review and says it needs time to fully consider the recommendations before making a response.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
Now, the spring fertiliser market has been a bit lumpy of late, with farmers holding off purchasing decisions and suppliers trying to claw back margin. We caught up with India Trembath, fertiliser product manager for farmer-owned buying group From Farmers.
Really, there are so many factors currently influencing the fertiliser markets. Demand starting to pick up again, which is one of the major factors. Over the last 6 months or so, the fertiliser markets have been so quiet. I think you've just got to consider what farmers have gone through in terms of weather as to how that's impacted their attitude to buying crop inputs. You've got energy prices that have just been increasing over the last couple of months. And with that, suppliers, so using CF, who produce nitram in the UK as a prime example, they have, over the last couple of years, they've actually stopped producing their own ammonia gas and they're now importing to help with their production. And obviously, given what energy prices are doing, that is putting a huge strain on their cost of production. Urea is another important one. So urea markets are impacted again by multiple different factors, demand being one, currency being another. Currently, the pound is weak against the dollar, which doesn't ever help pricing. You've got various urea tenders going on. So India is actually a big user of the product, and therefore they tend to tender for roughly 1 million tonnes sometimes with urea, which obviously takes a huge amount of product out of the supply chain. So things are pretty volatile at the moment in the fertiliser market.
So things pretty bumpy then, India, when it comes to supply and demand.
Yes, yeah. And I think the other thing that has been putting farmers off is obviously, I'm not an expert in the grain trade at all, but grain markets, pricing wise isn't exactly brilliant at the moment. And therefore there's still quite a lot of grain sitting in sheds, and the space for fertiliser is key for farmers wanting to take delivery. So many of them are almost put off by buying because they know that they cannot take it for a certain period of time. And until that picks up, they're still not willing to really commit to anything. And payment is another big factor as to perhaps why farmers are sitting tight and waiting to see what the markets do. But a good point to add to it as well is that farmer buying habits have really changed over the last few years. Many farmers are almost splitting up their requirements throughout the year. So they will buy a little at new season, so whether it's AN or urea, and then they will perhaps come back again a little bit later on. They'll be watching the markets or speaking to us as well on market intelligence and waiting for that next dip in the market to then come back in and buy again. So compared to, say, maybe 5 to 10 years ago, you might get that farmer when fertiliser prices and markets probably looked a lot better than what they do currently. They might just buy it all in one hit. And we do still have the odd member that comes back and they will buy religiously at each point in the year. But I do see it becoming more of a habit for them splitting up their ordering to help spread that risk and help spread that cost as well.
Yeah, understandably, different situations require different strategies. What are you advising your members to do at Fram Farmers India?
Personally, from a Fram Farmers point of view, we have been advising our members to be looking at securing their fertiliser requirements for at least the last 3 or 4 months. We saw quite early on what we thought or predicted the markets would be doing, which they have done what we thought they would. And pricing has climbed up. And I think a lot of farmers, some listened, some decided to sit on their hands and wait, which, okay, maybe for their business might have been the right decision, but they have certainly missed out on that price and that opportunity that was there. So for those that are listening who have their fertiliser requirements left to purchase for spring, certainly, definitely start speaking to your local reps, and definitely get something on the book sooner rather than later.
That's India Trembath from Fram Farmers. Louise, a very mixed picture then when it comes to fertiliser. What are the arable farmers that you speak to saying? Are they all sorted yet?
Well, the answer to that is some and some, Johann. As always, traditionally, most of the nitrogen, or a large slug of the nitrogen, was bought ahead, bought early, and then it was there ready in the barn to be used when the conditions were right, and when they were told to go out and get on with the fertiliser. Of course, there's been a lot of change in buying patterns and buying behaviour, and that's all going to be related, of course, to cash flow. So it's expensive stuff, nitrogen fertiliser, wherever the price settles out this week. And we've had a real hit on farm cash flows, haven't we, following the budget? So these buying decisions are probably being delayed or being different this year. So there will be some who are very organised, they've got everything they need. There are others who are still in the market and they need to know what's happening with the price of this fertiliser.
And Hugh, you're an organised kind of guy. You're all sorted, I take it, yeah?
I am now, but I wish I had, I should have gone earlier. Normally I either go sort of, November, December, but I ended up sort of leaving it, I suppose, because you think, the price is fairly steady. And then, boom, they do all this naughty price pulling just after Christmas. Now, you could, lots of cynics in the room could say, well, they're just trying to recover a bit of margin and do all that. But it has caused some confusion. But I think the underlying message I got when I spoke to my fertiliser broker was that sounds very grand, doesn't it? I don't buy that much, by the way. But he was saying loads of interest, zero commitment. And that's the problem, for all the reasons that Louise has just stated. I think, understandably, people are really nervous and they're just waiting for the right time to buy, or they've already got it in store anyway.
And of course, behind that, Hugh, spring is approaching.
Yeah.
I don't know when you would first get out with your first lot of nitrogen fertiliser, but people do start to get a bit twitchy as the calendar moves on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if we get, if who knows what February holds in store weather-wise, there's a rough old weekend coming. I know that for the next few days. My screen after that, it settles down again. And if we can get out on some grass in February, fantastic. With the first hit, that would be perfect. We've got stuff in store anyway to go. But yes, people are definitely thinking, and it's like they always say, isn't it? Whenever you speak to any of the people selling fertiliser, first nice day in January and the phone goes ballistic, or the first nice day in December and the phone goes ballistic as people think to what they should be doing. So yeah, it's a bit of an unpredictable market at the moment, and it's probably, I suppose, Louise, some of the alternatives like foliar feeds. I mean, we use a bit of that now. Well, we use quite a lot of that on maize. That will be having some impact. I don't know if it's a huge one, is it? But presumably it's having some impact on the traditional prilled market.
Oh, I'm sure that it will be having some impact. I mean, there are, as you say, there are alternatives now, and people are very interested in those for all the right reasons, and being more targeted and environmentally responsible, if you like, with their fertiliser. So I don't think they're probably affecting the market at this stage of the season. I think they tend to come in a bit later. But as you say, we've got a whole range of foliar products. We've also got the start now of these sort of lower emission fertilisers that are coming into the market. Well, they're being tested certainly on farms at the moment to see what they have to offer as well. So Yes, there are other things. There's also, of course, probably less crop in the ground. So, yeah, there are other factors coming into play with fertiliser buying. But as you and I have discussed, you go back to the biggest one being this uncertainty and the cash flow pressure. As we said, it's a big purchase.
Lots of uncertainty at the moment in many markets, challenges for some, opportunities for others. That's it though for this week's episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast. Do remember, you can email us at podcast@fwi.co.uk, and as we always say, if you're in the UK, you can also message us by texting the word farm followed by your message to 88440. We'll be back next week with all the news, views and analysis on the big stories affecting UK agriculture. But for now, I'm Johann.
I'm Louise Impey.
And I'm Hugh Broom.
Thank you for listening.